Waiting was not new to her, but trusting the timing was. She had learned how to endure a delay, how to remain faithful, how to stay in the process. What she hadn't learned yet was how to stop wrestling with when. She trusted God with the outcome. She trusted Him with the process. But time was harder. Time felt personal. Every unanswered prayer felt heavier as days turned into months. Every promise felt more distant as waiting stretched longer than expected. Every delay felt like a quiet question. Why not now? She never doubted God's power. She struggled with His pace because God's timing rarely moves at the speed of urgency. It moves at the speed of formation, and formation is slow. She wanted progress, God wanted depth. She wanted resolution, God wanted readiness. She wanted answers, God wanted trust. Trusting God with the timing meant releasing the calendar. She kept checking in her heart. It meant letting go of internal deadlines, of silent comparisons, of the belief that delay meant denial, or silence meant absence. Waiting had taught her patience, but trusting timing asked for something deeper. Surrender. Surrender of control. Surrender of expectations. Surrender of the belief that she knew when things should happen, and that was uncomfortable because timing touches fear. Fear of missing out. Fear of falling behind. Fear that waiting too long might mean losing something forever. She brought those fears to God, sometimes calmly, sometimes with frustration, sometimes in quiet tears. And God did not rush her. He didn't explain Himself. He didn't speed up to reassure her. He stayed steady, because God's timing is not designed to calm anxiety. It is designed to grow trust. There came a moment when she realized something essential. She could keep fighting the timing, or she could learn to rest in it. Fighting made her anxious. Resting made her open. Trusting God with the timing did not mean she stopped hoping. It meant she stopped demanding. She stopped asking, "Why isn't this happening yet?" and began asking, "What is God forming in me now?" And that question changed how she waited. If you've ever trusted God, but struggled with when, if delay has tested your faith more than suffering ever did, if waiting has made you restless, fearful, or quietly discouraged, stay. This message is for the woman who is learning that God's timing is not late, not careless, not indifferent. It is intentional. And if these words already feel like relief, like something settling into place, consider subscribing, not for the channel, but so your heart always has a place to return when waiting stretches longer than you expected. Now, let's walk through what changes when she finally trusts God with the timing. Letting go of control was difficult, but letting go of timing felt even harder because timing touches hope. She could surrender outcomes as long as she believed they would come soon. She could endure process as long as she believed there was an end in sight. She could stay faithful as long as waiting felt temporary. But when waiting stretched, something deeper was tested. She realized that timing was where her trust struggled most. She trusted God's wisdom. She trusted His goodness. She trusted His power. What she struggled to trust was His pace, because His pace did not match her sense of urgency. It did not align with her internal clock. It did not respect the timelines she quietly carried. She had expectations she never named out loud. A season that should have ended by now. A prayer that should have been answered already. A door that felt overdue. And every delay felt like tension building inside her. She asked herself, why timing felt so personal? Why waiting stirred anxiety more than difficulty ever had? Why uncertainty about when felt heavier than uncertainty about how? And slowly, she understood the truth. Timing threatens control in a way nothing else does. Because if she controlled the timing, she could protect herself from disappointment. She could prepare emotionally. She could manage hope, but trusting God with timing meant risking hope fully. It meant believing that God was not only able, but attentive, not only faithful, but intentional. It meant believing that delay was not neglect, and that was hard, because delay feels like silence. Silence feels like distance, and distance feels like being forgotten. But God was not distant. He was deliberate. She began to see that God's timing was not random or careless. It was deeply connected to who she was becoming. What felt slow to her was often precise to Him. What felt late was often protective. What felt like waiting was often preparation. God was not withholding. He was aligning her heart, aligning her trust, aligning her dependence. She realized that if God answered sooner, she might receive the outcome, but miss the formation. And formation was what her soul needed most. Trusting God with timing was not about learning patience. It was about learning humility, about accepting that God sees further, knows deeper, works wiser, and that her sense of urgency was not always aligned with His purpose. So she began to loosen her grip, not perfectly, not quickly, but sincerely. She stopped checking the calendar with anxiety, stopped measuring progress by speed, stopped interpreting delay as failure, and little by little, she began to trust that the God who called her was not late. He was preparing something and preparing her. As she learned to trust God with the timing, she began to notice something quietly unsettling. Her urgency was not neutral. It was fueled by fear. Not always obvious fear, but the kind that hides beneath reason. The kind that whispers instead of shouts. The kind that makes waiting feel dangerous. Fear of missing what God had promised. Fear of falling behind others. Fear that time was slipping away, while she stood still. Waiting felt risky, because waiting left space for doubt to speak, for comparison to creep in, for questions to grow louder. She watched others move forward, while her life seemed paused. She saw prayers answered around her, while hers remained suspended. She felt time passing, without visible progress, and fear translated that delay into urgency. Something must be wrong. You should be further along by now. If God hasn't moved yet, maybe you should. Urgency made waiting unbearable. It pushed her to rush decisions, to force doors, to settle for shortcuts, instead of trusting God's pace. But God gently revealed the truth. Urgency was not coming from faith, it was coming from fear. Fear does not trust time. It demands control. It believes that if things don't happen quickly, they may never happen at all. But God does not work under fear's deadlines. He works with intention. She began to see that her anxiety about timing was less about God's faithfulness and more about her fear of loss. Loss of opportunity, loss of youth, loss of momentum, loss of hope. Waiting made those fears visible, and God did not shame her for them. Instead, He invited her to bring them into the light, to admit that waiting scared her, to confess that delay made her anxious, to acknowledge that trusting timing felt like standing still while everything else moved on. And in that honesty, God met her. He reminded her that nothing meant for her could pass her by, that His plans were not fragile, that time does not outrun grace. God's timing does not compete with fear. It outlasts it. She realized that fear made waiting feel urgent, because fear believes everything depends on speed, but faith believes everything depends on God. Trusting God with the timing meant learning to identify urgency for what it was, not wisdom, not discernment, but fear asking to be soothed. And instead of obeying fear, she began to listen to God. God was not rushed. He was present. He was not delayed. He was deliberate. And the moment she saw that, waiting stopped feeling like a threat. It became an invitation to trust that God was not losing time. He was using it. At some point, waiting stopped feeling like punishment, not because it ended, but because her posture changed. She realized that waiting did not have to be filled with anxiety, comparison, or constant questioning. Waiting could become a place of trust. But that shift did not happen all at once. At first, she still checked the timeline in her heart, still wondered how much longer, still felt the ache of not knowing. But slowly, as she chose to trust God with the timing, the tension began to loosen. She stopped waking up every day, asking if this would be the day, stopped measuring her faith by how quickly things moved, stopped interpreting delay as rejection. She learned to let days be days, not placeholders, not obstacles, but moments God was present in. Waiting no longer felt empty. It became a space where she practiced trust in real time. Trust when nothing changed. Trust when prayers stayed unanswered. Trust when progress remained invisible. She discovered that waiting was not about inactivity. It was about attentiveness. Attentiveness to God's presence. Attentiveness to her own heart. Attentiveness to what God was shaping beneath the surface. She noticed subtle changes. Her prayers became quieter, less demanding, more relational. Instead of asking, "When will this happen?" she began asking, "How can I remain faithful here?" Instead of counting days, she began noticing grace, grace in small mercies. Grace in daily strength, grace in the ability to keep going without clarity. Waiting no longer felt like standing still, while life passed her by. It felt like walking slowly, but God. Side by side, unrushed, unforced, she realized that God was not withholding timing to test her endurance. He was offering timing to deepen her trust. And in that place of trust, she found rest. Not rest because things resolved, but rest because she was no longer fighting time. She accepted that God's pace was not meant to frustrate her. It was meant to free her from the illusion that speed equals blessing. Waiting became less about when and more about with whom. And as long as God was with her, time lost its power to threaten her peace. There came a moment when she stopped negotiating with time. She stopped asking God to hurry, stopped explaining why now would make more sense, stopped comparing her season to someone else's progress. She released the calendar she had been carrying in her heart, not because she no longer cared, but because she trusted God enough to stop measuring her life by dates and deadlines. This release did not feel dramatic. It felt quiet, almost ordinary, but it changed everything. She no longer lived with her eyes fixed on the future, waiting for permission to be at peace. She learned to be present without resentment toward delay. She trusted that God's timing was not withholding joy. It was protecting it, because some answers, if given too early, can harm instead of heal. Some doors, if opened before readiness, can wound instead of bless. God's timing was not about control, it was about care. She realized that God was not asking her to like the waiting. He was asking her to trust Him in it, and trust changed how she lived. She made decisions without panic. She prayed without bargaining. She hoped without obsession. She no longer treated waiting as a temporary inconvenience. She honored it as a sacred space, a space where God was still present, still guiding, still faithful. Releasing the calendar did not remove desire. It removed desperation. She stopped rushing what God was still forming, stopped forcing clarity before maturity arrived, stopped trying to outrun the pace of grace, and in that surrender, peace found her, not because time moved faster, but because she stopped fighting it. In the end, she did not receive a timeline, she received trust. She learned that God does not operate on urgency. He operates on purpose. That delay is not neglect. That silence is not absence. That waiting is not wasted. She stopped asking, "When will this happen?" and began believing, God knows when. Trusting God with the timing did not make waiting easy, but it made it meaningful. She no longer lived as if her life were on hold. She lived present, faithful, available to grace in the now. And that was freedom. If you are in a season where timing feels heavy, where waiting tests your faith more than struggle ever did, where you love God but wish He would move faster, let this be your reminder. God is not late. He is not rushed. He is not careless with your life. He is attentive. He is intentional. And He is with you in every moment of waiting. If you want a place to return, when patience feels thin and trust feels stretched, consider subscribing, not for the channel, but for your journey. Because the God who promised is faithful, and His timing is always wiser than ours.